It started with a phone call I almost didn't answer. The number wasn't saved in my contacts, and I had already decided that, at 74, I no longer had the patience for robocalls or strangers asking for donations. I let it ring twice before picking it up with a quiet, distracted, "Hello?" There was a pause. Then a familiar voice said, "Mom?" I froze. Not because I didn't recognize my daughter's voice. I would have known it anywhere. It was the hesitation in it that caught me off guard. It sounded careful, almost as if she wasn't sure she should have called at all. "I was just wondering if you'd like to come over Sunday," she said. "The kids keep asking about you." I looked around my little kitchen while she waited for an answer. The kettle had just started to whistle. A crossword puzzle sat unfinished beside the window. The house was perfectly clean, just as it always had been. Too clean, too quiet. "I'd like that," I finally said. After we hung up, I stayed there for a long time with my hand resting on the counter. There was a time when I believed this phone call would have made me feel successful. Years ago, I would have thought, "See? Everything worked out. My family still loves me. I built a good life." But that wasn't the thought that came to me. Instead, I found myself wondering how many Sundays I had quietly traded away before anyone had stopped asking me to come. That question stayed with me for weeks. It wasn't comfortable. Some questions aren't. The older you get, the fewer excuses you have left to hide behind. Eventually, life removes enough noise that you're left sitting across from yourself, and that conversation can be surprisingly difficult. I'm Margaret Collins. I'm 74 years old. Most people who knew me during my career would probably describe me as dependable, responsible, dedicated. Some might even say inspiring. For 42 years, I worked in public education. I started as a third-grade teacher in a brick schoolhouse where the classroom smelled like chalk dust and old books. Later, I became vice principal, then principal. Thousands of children walked through those hallways while I stood at the front doors every morning, greeting them by name. Parents thanked me. Teachers respected me. The district gave me awards that gathered dust on shelves I rarely looked at. People often told me, "We don't know how you do it." Back then I smiled and answered, "Coffee helps." Everyone laughed. It was easier than telling the truth. The truth was I didn't know how to stop. If someone needed help, I volunteered. If another committee needed a chairperson, I accepted. If a family was struggling, I stayed late. If another teacher was overwhelmed, I took work home so they wouldn't have to. People called me generous. I secretly hoped they'd keep calling me that. At the time, I would have argued with anyone who suggested I cared what people thought. I would have insisted I was simply doing my job. Looking back now, I understand something I couldn't admit then. Every compliment felt like borrowing confidence. For a little while, I'd feel lighter. Then it faded. So I'd work harder, do more, help more people, say yes one more time. I didn't realize I was treating approval the way some people treat sugar. A quick burst, then hunger again. It took me decades to recognize the pattern. But the story didn't begin at the school. It began much earlier. When I was 9 years old, my mother and I lived in a tiny white house 2 blocks from the ocean. You could hear the gulls through the kitchen window every morning. The wallpaper peeled in the corners, and every winter the front door stuck whenever it rained. My mother worked at the town library. She wasn't unhappy. She was simply tired in the quiet way adults sometimes are. The kind of tired children notice without understanding. Money wasn't abundant, but somehow dinner always appeared on the table. School clothes always fit. Birthday cakes always had candles. Only much later did I understand how much she'd quietly gone without. One Saturday afternoon, she asked if I'd come with her to visit my aunt. I remember sitting in the passenger seat watching rain slide across the windshield while she rehearsed what she planned to say. Not aloud. Just under her breath, little fragments. "I'll pay her back next month. It's only temporary." I hate asking. I pretended not to hear. Children do that when they sense grown-up pain. They become experts at looking out windows. When we arrived, my aunt welcomed us warmly enough, but I still remember how my mother's shoulders changed. She stood differently, smaller somehow. She apologized 3 times before asking if she could borrow a little money until payday. My aunt happily agreed. There was no argument, no judgment. Nothing dramatic happened. But something happened inside me. On the drive home, my mother kept saying, "I'm so grateful." Then, after a long silence, she whispered something she probably thought I couldn't hear. "I just wish I didn't have to need anyone." That sentence settled somewhere deep inside me. Children don't always remember facts. They remember feelings. Without realizing it, I made a promise that afternoon. I would grow up to become someone nobody ever had to worry about. Someone useful, someone dependable, someone who never needed help. It sounded noble. Maybe it even was. But hidden inside that promise was another one I didn't know I was making. If I was always useful, maybe I'd always deserve to be loved. That's a dangerous bargain to make with yourself. Of course, I couldn't have understood that at 9 years old. I simply started trying harder. I studied harder than everyone else. If homework took an hour, I spent 2. If a teacher asked for volunteers, my hand went up before anyone else's. If another student forgot lunch, I offered half of mine. Adults loved that about me. Margaret is such a good girl. Margaret is so responsible. Margaret never causes trouble. Those words felt warm. I carried them home like little trophies. The funny thing about praise is that it doesn't always encourage who you are. Sometimes it quietly teaches you who you think you have to become. By high school, I couldn't remember the last time I disappointed anyone. At least, not on purpose. I was student council secretary, honor roll, choir, weekend volunteer at the library. My calendar stayed full. My heart stayed restless. Whenever I crossed one accomplishment off the list, I immediately searched for another. I thought ambition was driving me. Now I think it was fear. Fear that if I slowed down, people might discover there wasn't much underneath all the achievements. College came and went. Teaching felt like exactly where I belonged. The first time 25 little faces looked up at me waiting to learn something new, I knew I'd found meaningful work. Children don't care about your resume. They care whether you notice when they're having a bad day, whether you remember their favorite story, whether you smile when they walk through the classroom door. I loved that. Every afternoon I drove home exhausted in the best possible way. But gradually something subtle changed. Parents began thanking me. Administrators praised me. Other teachers asked me to mentor them. Each opportunity felt like another chance to prove myself. So I accepted every one. More responsibilities, longer evenings, weekends spent planning lessons. I told myself it was temporary, just until things settled down. They never did. Life rarely pauses simply because we ask politely. Looking back now, I don't think my biggest mistake was working hard. Hard work can be beautiful. My mistake was believing my value rose and fell with how much I accomplished for everyone else. It would take many more years and more than a few painful conversations before I finally understood the cost of living that way. But at the time, I couldn't see it. All I knew was that every morning I woke up asking the same silent question. How can I earn my place today? And for a long time, I thought I already knew the answer. The answer seemed obvious back then. Work harder, show up earlier, stay later, be the person nobody ever has to worry about. That became my rhythm without me realizing it. I wasn't chasing promotions. Not at first. I was chasing that quiet feeling that settled over me whenever someone said, "I don't know what we'd do without you." It never lasted very long. By the next morning, I was looking for another chance to earn it. My first classroom sat at the end of a long hallway with windows that overlooked the playground. Every September, I arranged the desks in neat rows, sharpened 24 pencils, and wrote each child's name on a small paper card before they arrived. Those first days always felt magical. Children walk into a classroom carrying invisible worlds with them. One is nervous because it's his first time away from home. Another is excited to make friends. One little girl refuses to let go of her grandfather's hand. A boy pretends not to care, but his backpack is clutched so tightly his knuckles turn white. You learn to notice those things. Teaching isn't only about reading and arithmetic. It's about paying attention. I love that part more than anything. One afternoon, a little boy named Noah stayed behind after everyone else had left. He shuffled toward my desk, holding a drawing folded in half. "I made this for you," he whispered. Inside was a picture of our classroom. The desks were crooked, the windows were enormous, and I was standing in the middle with a smile so wide it nearly reached both sides of the page. Across the top he'd written, in the uncertain handwriting of a 7-year-old, "My favorite place." I still have that drawing, not because it's beautiful, because it reminds me of the teacher I wanted to be before I confused being needed with being worthy. At the time, though, I saw every success as proof that I should simply keep doing more. When another teacher became ill, I covered her class. When the school organized a weekend reading program, I volunteered. When parents needed evening conferences, I stayed until the parking lot was nearly empty. None of it felt unreasonable by itself. That's how these things usually happen. Life rarely changes because of one dramatic decision. It changes through 1,000 tiny ones. One extra hour, one more responsibility, one more promise you make because saying yes feels easier than disappointing someone. Years passed almost without my noticing. Children I'd taught returned as teenagers. Some came back from college to introduce me to their fiancés. Others brought their own children to meet me. Those moments filled my heart. They also convinced me that slowing down would somehow betray the person everyone believed I was. Around my 15th year of teaching, the superintendent called me into his office. "I'd like you to consider becoming assistant principal." I laughed. "I belong in the classroom." He smiled. So did I. Then someone convinced me otherwise. For weeks I couldn't stop thinking about the offer. Part of me resisted. Another part heard a familiar whisper. "People believe you can do more." That whisper had guided so many of my decisions that I no longer recognized it as separate from my own voice. I accepted the position. Friends celebrated. My mother cried happy tears. "You've worked so hard," she said, squeezing my hands across her kitchen table. "I always knew you'd do something meaningful." I smiled because I knew she was proud. What I didn't tell her was that I was already wondering what came after assistant principal. Isn't that strange? Before I'd even started the new job, my mind had skipped ahead to the next mountain. The new office overlooked the school's front entrance. Every morning I watched children spill out of buses carrying backpacks nearly as big as they were. Teachers stopped by with questions. Parents scheduled meetings. The phone rang constantly. There was always another decision waiting. I became good at solving problems, perhaps too good. People naturally brought me more of them.
Someone once joked, "Margaret, if the roof caves in, you'll probably have a plan before the dust settles."
Everyone laughed. So did I. But driving home that evening, I realized something unsettling. I couldn't remember the last time anyone had asked how I was doing. Then another thought followed close behind. Would I even know how to answer? That question lingered longer than I expected. I brushed it aside, of course. There were lesson plans to review, budgets to approve, a school play to organize. Life kept moving, and I kept moving with it. Looking back, I don't think I ever consciously decided to put myself last. It happened because everyone else's needs felt immediate. Mine could always wait until tomorrow. Tomorrow became next month. Next month became next year. Years slipped quietly by that way. And while my career continued to grow, something else, something far more important, was beginning to ask for my attention. At first, it spoke so softly I barely heard it. Soon, it would become impossible to ignore. That something was my daughter Emily. By then, she was 12, old enough to notice when I was distracted, young enough to still keep trying to pull me back. She had dark hair that never stayed in place and a habit of talking with her hands whenever she got excited. She loved drawing, hated math, and could spend an entire afternoon making up stories about strangers she saw at the grocery store. When she was little, she followed me from room to room. If I folded laundry, she sat on the floor beside me. If I cooked, she dragged a chair to the counter. If I graded papers at the dining room table, she curled up nearby with crayons and construction paper. At first, I thought that was closeness. I thought simply being in the same room counted. For a while, maybe it did. But children grow. They stop asking simple questions. They begin bringing you the complicated parts of themselves. And those parts require more than physical presence. One Thursday evening, I came home later than usual. The school board had called an emergency meeting after a parent complaint, and what should have taken 30 minutes stretched into nearly 3 hours. By the time I walked through the front door, the house was dark except for the kitchen light. Emily was sitting at the table. A piece of chocolate cake sat untouched in front of her. There were 2 candles melted down to little pools of wax. I stopped in the doorway. For one confused second, I couldn't understand what I was looking at. Then I remembered her school art show. She had reminded me that morning. Actually, she had reminded me all week. I had promised I would be there. "Em," I said quietly. She looked up. Her face wasn't angry. That would have been easier. She just looked tired. "I saved you some cake," she said. I put my bag down too quickly, and a stack of papers slipped onto the floor. "I am so sorry. The meeting, it's okay." "No, it's not. I should have called." She pushed the plate toward me. "Mrs. Harper said my painting was one of the best in the class." "That's wonderful." "It was the one with the red boat." I nodded as if I knew exactly which painting she meant. I didn't. That was when she looked at me differently, not dramatically, just long enough for me to understand that she knew. "You don't remember it, do you?" I opened my mouth. Nothing came out. She stood, carried her plate to the sink, and said, "It's fine, Mom." Then she went upstairs. I stood alone in the kitchen, listening to her bedroom door close. The cake remained on the table between the burned-down candles. I wanted to follow her. I wanted to sit on the edge of her bed and apologize without excuses. Instead, I picked up the papers from the floor. That memory still embarrasses me, not because I didn't love her. I loved her more than I knew how to say. But when I felt ashamed, work was the place I knew how to hide. There were problems I could solve there, forms I could complete, schedules I could organize. At home, I had to sit with the possibility that I had hurt someone I loved. I was much less skilled at that. The next morning, I woke Emily early and made pancakes. I cut strawberries into little hearts. I told her we would go out that weekend, just the 2 of us. She smiled. Children are generous that way. They often accept the apology we are trying to make, even when we never say the actual words. We went to the beach on Saturday. The wind was cold, but she took off her shoes anyway and ran close to the water. For 2 hours, I left my work bag in the car. I remember feeling proud of myself for that. 2 hours, as if love could be measured by how long I resisted checking my messages. On the drive home, Emily told me about a girl at school who had been excluding her from a group of friends. I listened for a few minutes. Then I shifted into problem solving. "You should talk to your teacher." "I don't want to." "Then maybe you need different friends." "It's not that simple." "It usually is, sweetheart. You can't control other people." She turned toward the window. I kept talking. I explained boundaries, self-respect, confidence, all good advice, all useless in that moment. She didn't need a solution. She needed me to ask what had happened. She needed room to be hurt. But I had spent my life believing every difficult feeling was a problem to be fixed. Silence made me uncomfortable. Pain made me efficient. So I offered answers before I truly understood the question. That became another pattern. Whenever Emily struggled, I tried to improve the situation. When she was nervous about a test, I made a study plan. When she fought with a friend, I gave advice. When she cried after not making the school play, I listed other activities she could try. I thought I was helping her become strong. What I was really teaching her was that difficult feelings should be handled quickly and privately. By the time she reached high school, she stopped bringing them to me. She still told me about grades, schedules, college applications, things that could fit neatly into a conversation between appointments. But the real things, the heartbreaks, fears, questions went somewhere else. I didn't notice at first. I was promoted to principal when Emily was 16. The announcement came at the end of a long spring semester. The superintendent shook my hand in front of the school board. A photographer took pictures. Everyone applauded. I remember looking around the room and feeling a rush of something I mistook for happiness. This was what I had been working toward. My own school, my own staff, my name printed beneath the word principal. That evening, several teachers took me out to dinner. They raised their glasses and told stories about the times I had rescued difficult situations. One teacher said, "Margaret has carried half this school on her back." Everyone laughed and agreed. I laughed too. The words filled me with warmth. Then I drove home alone. The feeling faded before I reached my driveway. Inside, Emily was sitting on the living room floor, surrounded by college brochures. My husband, Daniel, was asleep in his chair with the television on low. Emily looked up. "How was dinner?" "Wonderful. Everyone was very kind." She held up 2 brochures. "Can I ask you something?" I glanced at the clock. It was nearly 11. "Of course." She placed the brochures side by side. "Which one do you think?" One school was 3 hours away. The other was across the country. I pointed to the closer one. "This is a wonderful program." She studied my face. "You didn't even look at the other one." "I know that school. It's very competitive. So is this one. We can talk about it tomorrow." "You always say that." Her tone caught me off guard. I set my purse down. "What is that supposed to mean?" She stood. "Nothing." "Emily." She took a breath, then looked away. "You always say we'll talk later. Then later comes and you're tired or there's some emergency at school. That's not fair." The words came out too quickly. Her expression hardened. I continued because I felt accused. "I have worked very hard to give you opportunities. Do you know how many parents would love to be able to help their child choose between schools like these? I know. I have never missed a tuition payment. I've never let you go without anything." "I know, Mom." "Then what exactly are you saying?" She looked at me for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was quiet. "I'm saying everybody gets the best version of you." I felt something tighten in my chest. She swallowed. "The teachers, the parents, the students, even strangers get your attention." "Emily." "But when you come home, there's nothing left." Daniel woke in his chair. The television continued murmuring behind us. No one moved. Emily wiped quickly beneath one eye, angry at herself for crying. Then she said the sentence that would follow me for years. "Everyone gets the best version of you except us." She picked up the brochures and walked upstairs. I stood there in the middle of the room. Daniel looked at me, but he didn't say anything. That silence felt like agreement. I was furious. Not at Emily. Not really. I was furious because part of me knew she was right. But knowing something and being ready to admit it are very different things. The next morning I left before anyone else woke up. I told myself I needed to prepare for my first week as principal. I arrived at school before sunrise and unlocked the front doors alone. The hallways were still dark. For years I had dreamed about having that office. Now, as I walked toward it, Emily's words seemed to follow me down the corridor. "Everyone gets the best version of you except us." I turned on the lights. The walls brightened. The building came alive. And I did what I had always done when a truth frightened me. I made myself too busy to hear it. For a while, becoming principal gave me exactly what I thought I wanted. There was always something urgent. A teacher needed support. A parent demanded answers. A child was struggling. A budget had to be defended. A crisis appeared before breakfast and another one arrived before lunch. I became the person everyone called, the one who knew what to do, the one who stayed calm, the one who always found a solution. From the outside, it looked like confidence. Inside, it felt more like survival. As long as other people needed me, I didn't have to ask what I needed. As long as the school was busy, I didn't have to sit with the quiet growing inside my own home. Emily left for college the following fall. She chose the school across the country. I told everyone I was proud of her independence. That was true. It was also easier than admitting I had hoped she would choose the closer one. On the morning she left, Daniel loaded her suitcases into the car while I checked the time every few minutes. I had a district meeting at 10. I told myself there was plenty of time. Emily stood in the driveway wearing a gray sweatshirt and holding a paper cup of coffee. Her hair was tied back. She looked older than she had the day before. That's one of the strange things about children. You watch them grow in tiny pieces for years. Then one morning they stand in front of you as someone new. "Do you have everything?" I asked. "I think so." "Your documents?" "Yes." "Medication?" "Yes, Mom." "Emergency numbers?" She smiled a little. "They're in my phone." Daniel closed the trunk and stepped back. I hugged her. It was a good hug. Warm. Real. But even then, part of my mind was calculating how long it would take to reach the district office. When we pulled apart, Emily looked at me. "Don't forget to call." "I won't." "Not just text." "I know." She smiled again, but it didn't reach her eyes. Then she climbed into the car beside Daniel, who had volunteered to drive with her. I stood in the driveway as they pulled away. For a few seconds, I felt the full weight of what was happening. My daughter was leaving home. A whole chapter of our life had ended. Then my phone rang. By the time I arrived at the meeting, I had already pushed the feeling aside. That became easier with practice. Emily called often during her first semester. At first, our conversations were long. She described her roommate, the campus, the strange food in the dining hall, the professor who spoke so quickly nobody could take notes. I listened while answering emails. Sometimes she would stop and ask, "Are you still there?" "Of course." "You're typing." "Just finishing one thing." Eventually, the calls grew shorter, then less frequent. I blamed college life, new friends, new responsibilities. I told myself distance was natural. What I didn't ask was whether I had taught her not to expect too much from me. Years passed. Emily graduated. She found work in another city. She got married in a small garden ceremony on a warm June afternoon. I helped organize everything. The flowers, the seating, the food, the schedule. People praised how smoothly the day unfolded. At the reception, a woman I barely knew touched my arm and said, "You must be so proud. You raised a wonderful daughter." I smiled. Then I looked across the room and saw Emily laughing with Daniel. For a moment I had the strange feeling of watching my own life from a distance. She looked happy, confident, completely at ease. And I realized there were parts of her life I knew only in outline. Her favorite restaurant, the names of her closest friends, the things she feared at night, the dreams she had stopped telling me about. I knew where she worked. I knew what time her flight arrived. I knew which flowers she had chosen. But I didn't know what she whispered to her husband when she needed comfort. That realization came quietly. Then the photographer called us over for family pictures, and I smiled on command. I became even busier after that. I told myself the school depended on me. In truth, I depended on the school too. It gave me a role I understood. At home, there were fewer problems to solve. Daniel had built his own life around my schedule. He gardened, read history books, met friends for coffee. He rarely complained. That should have made things easier. Instead, His patience made my absence harder to see. One evening, after I canceled dinner for the third time that month, I came home to find a plate covered with foil in the refrigerator. A note sat beside it. Gone to the movies. Heat for 3 minutes. No accusation. No anger. Just instructions. I stood there holding the note longer than necessary. Then I heated the plate and ate alone at the kitchen counter. I told myself marriage changes. People become independent. That was healthy. But the house felt different, not hostile, just organized around my absence. The truth might have reached me then if I had allowed it. Instead, I filled the silence with more work. By the time I was 68, people had begun asking when I planned to retire. I hated the question. I laughed it off. What would I do with myself? Everyone assumed I was joking. I wasn't. Retirement sounded less like freedom and more like disappearance. Who was I without the morning announcement? Without teachers lining up outside my office? Without parents asking for help? Without my name printed at the top of official letters? The thought frightened me more than I wanted to admit. Still, my body had begun making decisions my mind refused to make. I was tired more often. My knees hurt after walking the halls. I caught myself rereading the same emails. Once, during a staff meeting, I forgot the name of a teacher I had worked with for 6 years, only for a second. But I saw the concern flicker across her face. A month later, I stood in my office after everyone had gone home and looked at the rows of framed photographs on the wall. Graduating classes, award ceremonies, holiday concerts. So many smiling faces. My entire adult life was contained in those frames. And for the first time, I wondered whether staying was still devotion or simply fear. I announced my retirement that spring. The school held a celebration in the gymnasium. Former students returned. Teachers made speeches. Children sang a song. The district presented me with a glass plaque engraved with my name and 42 years of service. I cried. Everyone cried. It was beautiful. For one evening, I felt completely surrounded by love. Then the next morning, I woke before 6 out of habit. I lay in bed listening for the alarm. It never rang. Daniel was still asleep beside me. The room was pale with early light. For the first time in 42 years, nobody was waiting for me. At first, retirement felt like a vacation. I cleaned closets, reorganized the kitchen, sorted old photographs into boxes. I made long lists. Call the insurance office. Repair the back gate. Donate old clothes. Update the guest room. I moved from task to task with the same intensity I had brought to the school. Daniel watched me for a few weeks before saying anything. One morning, he found me alphabetizing the spices. "Margaret," he said gently, "you know you don't have to turn retirement into another job." I laughed. "I'm just getting organized." The cumin was already organized. It was beside the cinnamon. He leaned against the counter. "That's where most people keep it." I smiled, but the joke unsettled me. After the house was organized, I joined 3 committees, then a local charity board, then a neighborhood project. I accepted every request. People still needed help. For a while, that kept me comfortable. But without the school, the praise came less often. There were no assemblies, no announcements, no hallway full of people who knew my name. Some days the phone didn't ring at all. I began checking my email too often, refreshing the screen, waiting for someone to ask for something. That was when I first noticed the emptiness. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't feel like sadness exactly. It felt like walking into a room where the furniture had been removed. The room was still there, but I didn't know where to sit. One rainy afternoon, I opened a box of old photographs. Most of them were from school, classrooms, staff dinners, awards. At the bottom, beneath a stack of certificates, I found the drawing Noah had given me all those years ago. My favorite place. I sat on the floor holding it. The paper had softened at the folds. The crayon lines had faded. I remembered his little hand pushing it across my desk. I remembered how proud I had felt. Then another memory came. Emily at the kitchen table. 2 melted candles. A piece of cake. You don't remember it, do you? I placed the drawing in my lap. For the first time, I let both memories exist together. The teacher who had made a child feel seen. The mother who had failed to see her own daughter. I cried then, not loudly, not in the way people cry at funerals or after terrible news. It was a quieter kind of grief. The grief of finally understanding something too late to change it. Daniel found me there. He lowered himself slowly onto the floor beside me. Neither of us spoke for a while. Then I held up the drawing. I was good at that, I said. At what? Making children feel important. He looked at the paper. You were. I wiped my face. Why couldn't I do it at home? He didn't answer immediately. That was one of Daniel's strengths. He never rushed to fill silence. Finally, he said, maybe home was the one place you were afraid you wouldn't know how. I looked at him. The words landed deeper than I expected. At school, I had a title. Rules, schedules, experience. At home, love required something less polished. It required uncertainty, patience, admitting when I didn't know what to say. I had always found that harder. A few weeks later, I began volunteering at a small community reading center. It was not an impressive place. The carpet was worn. The shelves didn't match. Half the books had handwritten labels taped to the spines. Children came after school to read with volunteers or finish homework while their parents worked late. I told myself I was there to help. That was partly true. Mostly, I needed somewhere to go. On my first afternoon, the coordinator introduced me to a man named Arthur Bennett. Arthur was 81, a retired fisherman, quiet voice, weathered hands. He wore the same brown jacket almost every day and carried peppermints in his pocket for the children. He didn't seem particularly interested in my former position. When I mentioned I had been a principal, he nodded. That sounds busy. That was all. No admiration, no follow-up questions. For some reason, I found that refreshing. Arthur read slowly. He let children struggle with words instead of rescuing them immediately. When one little girl became frustrated, he closed the book and asked her about the picture on the cover. Within minutes, she was talking again. I watched him from across the room. He never appeared hurried, never looked at the clock, never seemed to need the children to like him. He was simply there. One afternoon, after the children had left, Arthur and I sat at a small table drinking weak coffee from paper cups. He asked how I was finding retirement. Busy, I said automatically. He smiled. That wasn't the question. I looked at him. He waited. The silence stretched. Then, to my surprise, I told him the truth. I don't think I know who I am without work. Arthur nodded as if I had said something ordinary. He peeled the paper from his cup. I had the same trouble after my wife died. I wasn't sure what to say. He continued. For 53 years, I was her husband. Before that, I was a fisherman. When both things were gone, I kept looking for another name to put on myself. What did you find? He shrugged. Nothing useful. I laughed softly. Then he looked toward the empty reading room. I spent most of my life trying to earn a place somewhere, he said. At work, in my family, in other people's good opinion. He tapped one finger against the table. Then one day I realized I had been standing outside a door that was never locked. I frowned slightly. Arthur smiled. People spend their whole lives trying to earn a seat at a table that was already theirs. The room seemed to grow very still. He took another sip of coffee and began talking about the weather, but I barely heard him. That sentence followed me home. It followed me into the kitchen, into bed, into the quiet hours before morning, a seat at a table that was already mine. I had spent nearly 70 years trying to become useful enough, dependable enough, admired enough to deserve love. What if love had never required any of that? The thought should have felt comforting. Instead, it frightened me, because if Arthur was right, then I had spent much of my life proving something that had never needed proof. And once I allowed myself to consider that possibility, another question appeared. What would happen if I stopped trying? For several days I carried Arthur's question around with me. What would happen if I stopped trying? At first, I treated it like one of those ideas that sounds meaningful over bad coffee but disappears once real life resumes. I went home, made dinner, answered emails, updated the volunteer schedule, agreed to help organize a fundraiser at the reading center. By Thursday, my calendar was full again. That should have made me feel better. Instead, every new commitment seemed to underline the question. What would happen if I stopped trying? Trying to be useful, trying to be impressive,
Trying to stay one step ahead of disappointment.
I had spent so many years arranging my life around other people's needs that I no longer knew which parts belonged to me.
Even my generosity had become complicated.
I truly wanted to help, but hidden beneath that desire was something less comfortable. I wanted people to need me because being needed felt safer than simply being loved. Need could be measured. It had evidence, a phone call, a favor, a thank you card. Love was different. Love asked me to trust what could not always be proven. One Saturday morning I stood in the kitchen making coffee when Daniel walked in and placed an envelope on the table. "What's that?" I asked. "Train tickets?" I turned around. "To where?" "Emily's." I stared at him. "She invited us?" "No." He pulled out a chair. "I thought we might ask." My first reaction was irritation. It came so quickly that I almost didn't recognize what was underneath it. Fear. "She's busy," I said. "The children have school. She and Michael both work." "Then she can say no." "I don't want to impose." Daniel looked at me for a moment. "You spent 40 years telling people it was all right to ask for help." "That's different." "Is it?" I picked up my coffee. He didn't argue. Daniel had learned long ago that pushing me usually made me dig in harder. He simply left the envelope on the table and went outside. I stood there looking at those 2 tickets. My daughter lived less than 4 hours away. We spoke every few weeks. We exchanged birthday gifts. We saw one another at holidays. There had been no dramatic falling out. That almost made the distance harder to understand. Nothing had broken all at once. We had simply become polite. Careful.
Good at avoiding the places where honesty might hurt.
I picked up my phone, then put it down, made the bed, wiped the kitchen counters, watered plants that did not need water. Finally, just before noon, I called her. She answered on the 4th ring. "Hi, Mom." "Hi, sweetheart. Is this a bad time?" "No, I'm folding laundry." I could hear children talking somewhere behind her. For a few seconds, neither of us said anything. Then I looked at the envelope again. "Your father bought train tickets." She laughed. "That sounds like Dad. He thought we might visit next weekend." There was a pause, not a long one, just long enough for me to notice. "Of course," she said. "You don't have to ask." But I did have to ask. That was the point. I swallowed. "Would you actually like us to come?" The line went quiet again. When Emily answered, her voice had changed. "Yes," she said softly. "I would." We arrived the following Friday. Her house was warmer and messier than mine. Shoes by the door. Children's drawings taped to the refrigerator. A stack of unopened mail on the counter. The living room rug had a stain near the sofa that someone had tried unsuccessfully to hide beneath a small table. I loved it immediately. My grandchildren ran toward us. Lucy wrapped both arms around my waist. Ben shouted something about a science project before I had even removed my coat. For the first hour, I stayed busy. I handed out gifts, helped in the kitchen, asked about school, complimented the house. Old habits know how to make themselves useful. At dinner, Michael asked about the reading center. I began describing the fundraiser, the planning committee, the shortage of volunteers, the goals for the coming year. I spoke for several minutes before noticing Emily watching me, not critically, just quietly. I stopped mid-sentence. I'm doing it again, aren't I? Michael looked confused. Emily lowered her fork. Doing what? Giving a report. A small smile crossed her face. You do like reports. Everyone laughed, including me. The tension eased, but later that night, after the children were asleep and Daniel and Michael had gone into the living room, Emily and I remained at the kitchen table. 2 mugs of tea sat between us. Rain tapped lightly against the windows. It reminded me of the day my mother had asked my aunt for money. I wondered how many of our deepest moments begin in ordinary kitchens while the rest of the world carries on. Emily tucked one foot beneath her chair. You seem different, she said. I'm older. That's not what I mean. I looked down at my hands. The skin was thinner now, veins more visible. The hands of my mother, I suddenly thought. I've been thinking about some things. That sounds dangerous. I smiled. Then the smile faded. I had rehearsed this conversation on the train. In every version I sounded thoughtful and composed. Now that she was sitting across from me, every carefully prepared sentence felt false. So I started with the only honest words I had. I'm sorry. Emily became still. I continued before fear could pull me back. I know I've apologized for missing things. Your art show, phone calls, dinners, but I don't think I ever apologized for the real thing. She looked at me but said nothing. The real thing was making you feel as if everyone else came first. Her eyes dropped toward the table. I could hear Daniel laughing in the other room. For a moment, I wanted to soften what I had said, explain the pressure, the school, my childhood, all the reasons I had become who I was, but explanations had protected me long enough. I loved you, I said. I always loved you, but I kept trying to show it by arranging your life, solving problems, paying for things, making sure nothing fell apart. Emily rubbed her thumb along the edge of her mug. You did a lot for me. I know. That answer surprised her. I took a breath. But doing a lot for someone isn't the same as being with them. Her eyes filled. Mine did too. I thought if I was useful enough, nobody could be disappointed in me, I said. And somehow I became so afraid of disappointing everyone that I disappointed the people closest to me. Emily looked toward the window. For several seconds, the only sound was the rain. Then she said, I used to wait for you. The words were quiet. They struck harder than anger would have. When I was little, I would hear a car outside and think it was you, even if you hadn't promised to come home early. I pressed my lips together. She continued, I knew your work mattered. I knew people depended on you. I was proud of you. She wiped beneath one eye, but sometimes I wished you would choose us even when nobody was forcing you to. There was nothing I could say that would make that less painful, so I didn't try. I let the silence remain. That may have been the first truly useful thing I had done in years. After a while, Emily said, Do you remember the red boat? My chest tightened. The painting. She nodded. I remember missing the show. But do you remember the painting? I closed my eyes. For years, I had carried that memory as evidence of failure. Emily at the table, the untouched cake, the melted candles, but the painting itself remained blank in my mind. No, I whispered. She stood and left the kitchen. I stayed in my chair, wondering if the conversation was over. A minute later, she returned, carrying a flat cardboard folder. She opened it on the table. Inside was a faded painting of a small red boat crossing dark blue water. The sky above it was gray. A thin line of yellow glowed on the horizon. I touched the edge of the paper. You kept it. Dad framed it for my room. I looked more closely. The boat was tiny compared with the water surrounding it, but it was moving toward the light. It's beautiful, I said. Emily smiled through tears. You would have said that even if it wasn't. No, I said. I would have told you how to improve the sky. She laughed. So did I. The laughter broke something open between us. Not everything. One conversation cannot repair years. People like to imagine reconciliation as a door swinging wide. In my experience, it is more often a window opened an inch at a time. Enough air enters for both people to breathe differently. I looked at my daughter. I don't expect you to tell me it's all right. She shook her head. It wasn't all right. I know, but I don't think you meant to hurt me. No. I know that too. She reached across the table and placed her hand over mine. I never needed you to be perfect, Mom. The sentence was simple. That made it almost unbearable. I just wanted you there. I bowed my head. For a long time, I had imagined that being forgiven would feel like relief. It did not. At first, it felt like grief. Grief for birthdays I could not return to. Calls I had answered with half my attention. Questions she had stopped asking. Forgiveness did not erase any of that. It simply allowed us to stop pretending it had not happened. When I looked up, Emily was still holding my hand. I squeezed hers. I'm here now, I said. I know. It was not a grand declaration, but it was true. We stayed at the table until after midnight. Emily told me things I had never known. How lonely she had felt during her first year at college. How frightened she had been after Lucy was born. How she sometimes worried that she was repeating my mistakes by working too much. My old instincts rose several times. Offer advice, create a plan, explain what she should do. Each time, I let the thought pass. I listened, really listened, not while preparing an answer, not while searching for a solution, just listening. It felt harder than leading any school meeting I had ever attended. It also felt more important. The next morning, Lucy found the painting on the kitchen table. Did Mommy make this? She did, I said. How old was she? About your age. Lucy studied it. The boat looks lonely. I glanced at Emily. She looked back at me. Maybe, she said, but it's not stuck. Lucy seemed satisfied with that answer. So was I. After that visit, my relationship with Emily did not suddenly become perfect. She still forgot to return calls. I still offered advice she had not requested. We occasionally slipped into our old roles. The difference was that we noticed. Sometimes Emily would say, Mom, I need you to listen, not fix it. And instead of feeling rejected, I would put my hands in my lap and say, all right, start again. Sometimes I caught myself describing every detail of a volunteer project and stopped. Report over, I would say. She would laugh. Little by little, we began to know one another again. Not as principal and student, not as provider and recipient. As two imperfect women trying to understand what love looked like after years of getting it partly wrong, I also began changing the shape of my days. At first, I resigned from only one committee. I drafted the email 3 times. The final version was 4 sentences long, yet sending it felt like stepping off a ledge. The reply came within an hour. Thank you for everything you've contributed. We understand completely. That was it. No disappointment. No collapse. The organization continued without me. I wish I could say that realization felt entirely freeing. Part of it hurt. I had spent years imagining certain things would fall apart if I stepped away. Discovering that they would not was humbling. It was also a relief. I resigned from another committee a month later. Then I stopped answering every message immediately. I left whole afternoons unplanned. The first few felt unbearable. I wandered from room to room, opened books without reading them, checked my phone, listened for a request that did not come. Then one morning I walked to the ocean. I had lived near it most of my life, yet I could not remember the last time I had gone there without an agenda. The beach was nearly empty. A man walked a brown dog near the water. 2 women collected shells. Farther down the shore, a child was building something with wet sand. I sat on a weathered bench and watched the tide come in. Nothing happened. No insight arrived. Nobody thanked me. Nobody needed a decision. I simply sat there. After perhaps 20 minutes, I noticed the sunlight moving across the water. It looked like thousands of small pieces of glass. I thought of my mother, how often she had looked tired, how much of herself she had measured by what she could provide. I wondered whether she had inherited that belief from someone else. Perhaps she had been trying to earn her seat too. The thought softened something in me. For years, I had judged myself for repeating patterns I had not known were patterns. Now I saw them more clearly, not as excuses, as inheritance. And inheritance can be accepted without being carried forever. I began returning to the beach twice a week. Sometimes I brought a book. Sometimes I brought nothing. At the reading center, I continued working with children, but I stopped trying to manage everything. When the coordinator asked if I would chair another fundraiser, I said no, but I can help for 2 hours on Saturday. The word no felt awkward in my mouth. The world did not end. Arthur noticed the change. One afternoon he handed me a peppermint and said, "You look less busy." "I'm trying." He smiled. "That still sounds busy." I laughed. "Then I'm not trying." "That's better." Arthur never asked about my conversation with Emily. He did not need a report. That was one of the things I liked about him. He trusted that people revealed themselves when they were ready. Months later, while we shelved books together, I said, "I think I finally understand what you meant about the table." He slid a book into place. What did I mean? "You don't remember?" "I say a lot of things." I shook my head. "You said people spend their lives trying to earn a seat that was already theirs." Arthur considered this. "That sounds pretty wise." "You said it." "Then I was having a good day." I smiled. He turned toward me. "Did you find your seat?" I thought about it. I think I stopped asking permission to sit down. Arthur nodded. "That'll do." Daniel noticed changes too. For years, we had lived beside each other with kindness but very little curiosity. Now I began joining him in the garden. I knew nothing about plants. This surprised him. "You ran a school," he said one morning. "Surely you can identify a tomato." I identified tomatoes after they're sliced. He showed me how to pinch dead leaves from the stems. I listened. When he told stories I had heard before, I stopped correcting details. We began taking slow evening walks. Some nights we talked, some nights we didn't. I discovered that silence between two people can feel empty or full. The difference is whether either person is trying to escape it. One evening, Daniel and I sat on the porch while the sky darkened. He asked, "Are you happy?" Years earlier, I would have answered immediately, "Of course." What else could I say? This time, I thought carefully. "Sometimes." He nodded. "Me too." That answer felt more honest than happiness ever had. I still have difficult days. I still notice when someone else receives praise. I still feel the old urge to prove I am useful. At 74, habits do not disappear simply because you understand them. Sometimes I agree to something and regret it. Sometimes I talk too much when I am nervous. Sometimes I turn love into a task list before I catch myself. But now I recognize the feeling beneath it. The little girl in the car, listening to her mother apologize for needing help. The child who decided dependence was dangerous. The woman who confused admiration with security. I do not scold her anymore. I simply remind her that she is no longer standing outside that door. A few months ago, Emily called me on a Sunday afternoon. Her voice sounded strained. She had argued with Michael. Work was overwhelming. Lucy was struggling at school. Everything seemed to have gone wrong at once. The old Margaret would have created a plan before Emily finished her first sentence. I almost did. Then I heard her take a shaky breath. So I asked, "Do you want advice or do you want company?" She was silent for a moment. "Company." "All right." We stayed on the phone for nearly an hour. I did not fix anything. Her work remained difficult. The argument still needed to be resolved. Lucy's problem did not disappear. But near the end of the call, Emily sighed. "Thank you, Mom." "For what?" "For being here." After we hung up, I sat in my quiet kitchen. The kettle had gone cold. A crossword puzzle lay unfinished near the window. For most of my life, an unfinished task would have bothered me. That afternoon, I left it exactly where it was. I thought about all the years I had tried to earn those 4 words. Thank you for being here. I believed they would come after enough work, enough sacrifice, enough achievement. But being here was not something I could prove through effort. It was something I had to choose. Again and again, I used to think my life would finally feel complete when I became important enough, when people respected me, when my work mattered, when my family was secure, when every loose end had been tied. Now I understand that life does not become complete in that way. There is always another loose end, another worry, another person you cannot protect from pain, another version of yourself you could become. If you wait until everything is settled before allowing yourself peace, you may spend your entire life waiting. I nearly did. The years I gave to my work were not wasted. I loved many children, helped families, supported teachers, built something meaningful. I no longer need to turn my past into a tragedy in order to learn from it, but I can also admit what it cost. Both things can be true. I was a good principal. I was not always a present mother. I helped people. I also hid inside being helpful. I loved my family. I sometimes made them compete with my need to feel valuable. Age has taught me that honesty does not require us to condemn ourselves. It only asks us to stop looking away. For a long time, I thought self-acceptance meant telling myself I had done nothing wrong. That is not what it means. It means being able to look at the whole story without running. The kindness, the failures, the fear, the effort, the damage, the love, all of it, and still saying, this is my life. I am responsible for it. I am grateful for it. And I am allowed to be here. Not because I earned a title, not because someone needs my help, not because I stayed late or worked harder or carried more than everyone else, simply because I am here. That truth would have sounded selfish to the younger version of me. Now it feels like peace. These days, I keep Emily's red boat painting in my living room. She finally let me take it home after having it reframed. It hangs above a small wooden table near the window. Visitors sometimes ask about it. I tell them my daughter painted it when she was 12. I do not tell them the whole story. Some stories become too personal to explain every time. But when I look at that little boat moving across the dark water, I no longer see loneliness. I see a child trying to be noticed, a mother learning how to look, and a thin line of light that was there all along. I cannot return to the night of the art show. I cannot sit beside 12-year-old Emily and ask her to tell me about every brushstroke. I cannot recover the calls I half listened to, or the moments I rushed through. But I can answer the phone now. I can put down what I am holding. I can ask one more question. I can stay quiet long enough to hear the answer. Maybe that is what change really looks like. Not becoming a new person overnight, not erasing the woman you used to be. Just choosing differently when an old moment appears in a new form. I spent most of my life believing love was something I had to earn by becoming indispensable. It took retirement, silence, an old drawing, a patient husband, an honest daughter, and a retired fisherman with peppermints in his pocket to show me otherwise. The people who truly loved me were never waiting for me to become more impressive. They were waiting for me to come home. And perhaps, in my own way, I was waiting too. I thought I needed applause. What I needed was presence. I thought I needed to be admired. What I needed was to be known. I thought I needed everyone to depend on me. What I needed was to trust that love could remain even when I had nothing useful to offer. I am 74 now. Some mornings I still wake before the sun. The old instinct tells me to get up quickly, make a list, start accomplishing something. Sometimes I do. Other mornings, I stay where I am. I listen to Daniel breathing beside me. I watch the first light gather along the curtains. I let the day arrive without demanding that I prove I deserve it. And in those quiet moments, I finally understand something I had spent a lifetime overlooking. Peace was never waiting for me at the end of all my work. It was waiting for me to stop long enough to notice that I had already arrived.